Thank you, David. So first, just a sound check. Can everyone hear me now? Are we good? Okay. Thanks, Charlie. What I'd like to do, I went over in my mind about 1 million times how I was going to start today, and I'd like to start by playing you the theme, because that's where this all begins. So here we go. So those 32 bars, Anton Diabelli sent off, as David alluded to, in Vienna around 1819. And I have to be a little careful so I don't trip over myself a little bit here, because I want to save some for tomorrow, obviously. But he sent this off, and as the story goes, if you take a piano literature class, Beethoven cast this little theme aside and said he didn't want anything to do with it. But about 4 years later, he wrote the piece that I'm going to talk to you about today. Before I officially start, I'll just give a little nod to this project. But before I do that, I want to thank Juday, who has helped me now record and edit 3 CDs. Some of you got a copy of this piece that I recorded last summer, the CD. If you didn't, I have some up here if you'd like one afterwards. I did do my dissertation, as David said, on this piece, and it has been a journey, and it came, as probably all ideas do, it came over a little bit of time. I thought I should just replay this piece. That was my original thought. And then maybe I was on a run or a bike or a swim, and I thought, I should learn those 53. I talked about them in my dissertation. Why not learn them? And then I started thinking more about social constructs and social justice and equality. And that's when I got the idea to go out into the world and see what would happen. And kind of an amazing thing, I think, happened. So that'll be the story for Wednesday. And I guess what I'd like to do is start by reading a little bit from Maynard Solomon's late Beethoven book, because he so aptly describes the theme a little bit and talks about some of the things that we think about when we think about late Beethoven. And this is a late piece for Beethoven. He died in 1827. As a little aside, 2020 would have been the 250th anniversary, of his birth. And because of COVID, that wasn't really celebrated as people had hoped around the world. And for me, it meant that I didn't get to go to Costa Rica and do the national premiere of this piece in May of last year. It meant that I didn't get to go perform an abbreviated lecture recital about these 3 big works in Oklahoma last year. And so that's why I'm here now, is to kind of get to pay homage to this whole journey. I will talk more about this, but Maynard Solomon puts to rest one of the common myths about this. I said that Beethoven kind of cast this theme aside initially. Well, He didn't so much cast it aside as he took some time to reflect, I think. There's an erroneous story where he said, this is a cobbler's patch and it's not worth anything, but then suddenly he appears with 33 variations. And we will see that he borrowed some of the motives in one of his piano sonatas. But to get to the point with Maynard Solomon, I just want to give you a few little thoughts about late Beethoven. One of the things that's very profound that he writes is we know Beethoven by his beginnings. This is important. By themes, figures, rhythmic patterns, harmonic motifs, and sonic textures that instantly establish something essential about the character of a composition. Another place that he writes is, he says that from this admittedly restricted standpoint, we may say that embedded in the formal structures of Beethoven's late works are two great arcs of experience, in both of which he sought to inscribe, from opposite perspectives, chronicles of illumination and achievement. One arc begins from a dangerous, at least unfamiliar, territory or state of being and makes its way to safety by a circuitous route. The other takes its point of departure in the familiar, which is then disassembled, chaoticized, deconstructed, and defamiliarized before it, in turn, rediscovers an ultimate state of concord. He talks about literature and all sorts of things, but the last little bit that I'd like to finish with, he writes, by its utter indestructibility, its imperviousness to perpetual attempts to dismantle it, Diabelli's theme comes to stand for the unwearying tenacity of every individual and gives token of assurance of a permanent place in the order of things. The Diabelli Variations is not a conjurer's trick demonstrating how an unlikely edifice can be built upon an absurd foundation. It is a demonstration of a different kind, how one thing can be radically transformed into another or split into many without itself being annihilated. It is an essay on creative metamorphosis and a promise of endurance. So that says a lot, but what I'd like to do is just give you a quick little commentary about what's going on in this theme that attracted Beethoven. So the very first thing we have is a little grace note. We have a little turn figure. We have then a descending fourth motive. Then we have another little Rosalia turn figure. Then he picks up and does it again a step higher, basically. Then we have a sequence. Here's a sequence, up a step higher. Another one. We also have repeated notes, and that's important. We have C major triads. We have a rising idea in this sequence as well. At the end, just to close this off, same idea with the sequence. It's also in C major, which means that you don't have many sharps and flats going on. There's a few because of the sequence, but there's not many. And it's in what we call binary form, okay? So these are the kernels that serve as kind of a playground for a composer's mind. It's interesting because Beethoven wasn't responding to a melodic idea because there really isn't one. It's not singable, it's kind of awkward sounding. And Maynard Solomon makes the point that this is a kind of a a people's waltz. It's coming from commonalities. And I agree with that, but I would add that by using a waltz, Diabelli has tapped into the aristocratic aspect of Viennese society as well. So we have these two kind of intersecting expressive components that are happening. So what is and has been interesting for me is this juxtaposition of, you know, the highness and the lowness, shall we say. And what Beethoven does, as I'm going to show you, is progressively work towards kind of a spiritual transformation of this waltz into a minuet. As he does this, he includes a whole bunch of what I would call disruptions, or at least that's what I talked about in my dissertation. Thinking in terms of social justice, I guess I would posit to you all now that I would like to add to that a little bit and say that I've come to really view and become passionate about the variation structure itself as kind of a model for equality. So the entire premise of a variation structure is that it comes from a theme. You have a theme. I've played you the theme. And every variation in a variation, its duty is to pay homage to that theme somehow. Its duty is to show similarities. Its duty is to always represent that theme, right? But yet, it's also bound to do something diverse, to do something different, because otherwise it's not a variation. And so to me, the structure has been really captivating because you have this kind of essential juxtaposition between, on the one hand, espousing unity, and on the other hand, championing diversity, difference, and valuing how absolutely incredible those critical spaces between those two things really are. And so this has become the real passion of my project. And that's why I'm spending so much time on the theme, because what I would say now to augment what I said in 2006 is that those disruptions are not as much a disruption as they are diversity, shall we say. So I hope that maybe I can illuminate a little bit. So in Beethoven's journey, what you would expect is that he would immediately begin to take these simple rhythms and these little motivic ideas and play around with them and probably give us faster rhythmic values and show off. And that's kind of a typical character variations format. What he really does, of course, is something way more meaningful and profound than simply that. I said that this theme is kind of like a playground for a composer's mind. I kind of have this little joke that a theme like this, Diabelli was a smart man. A theme like this is kind of like me going to an all-you-can-eat Brazilian steakhouse. You know, the sky's the limit. You can pick what you want. And I always use food as kind of my metaphor for some reason. But it's actually true. And before we actually delve in, if anybody thinks that Beethoven wasn't captivated by Diabelli's theme, about the same time he was writing his last piano sonata, Opus 111. The second movement is also in C major. And this is what he decided to write. There's your fourth. There it is. very different than this fourth. Very different in character, but right there, same register. And if you don't know about Beethoven, the end of his life was all about kind of making his final struggle, finding some sort of spiritual plenitude, whatever that was for him. He struggled in his life, and his music is all about climbing, striving, falling back, climbing, striving again. It's very much the underdog kind of story in its narrative. I mean, his life is that. And what comes from him, of course, is this profound spiritual and, moreover, historically important and relative music that still universally speaks to us today. So what does Beethoven do in 33 variations to get us from A to B? So the first thing he does is completely dismantle the waltz into a march. So he's taken the dance, he completely upends it, different time signature, very different character. This exudes a lot of different topics and tropes. I mean, you don't have to be a music scholar to hear that that's very different than this world. Right? That's very different. So completely does not what's expected in a variation form. But then at the end of variation 1, he restores the triple meter of the waltz. So you get this kind of hocket texture going on. So we start in this, what seems like a banal little waltz, not very memorable, not very profound. We go to a very heavy march, disruption or diversity as I now like to think of it. And then we restore kind of this, okay, we're kind of back in waltz world a little bit, right? So variation 3 begins to kind of sing a little more. That little grace note now becomes something else, a third. Little hymn-like. Then variation 4, before I give you a tiny hint of this, there's another aspect of this piece that goes on, and that is the accumulation of counterpoint. So what's the big deal, right? So the biggest name composer before Beethoven is Bach. And Bach dies in 1750, Beethoven's born in 1770. And pretty much, I would say even now, if a composer resorts to fugal or contrapuntal textures or anything like that, the automatic association for our ears is that it has been elevated somehow to a higher plane of meaning. So whatever the expressive meaning is happening at a certain time, if it's comic, it's more comic. If it's tragic, it's more tragic, okay? So throughout this piece, you're gonna hear this accumulation of counterpoint. And we get a very small hint of imitation in variation 4. So it kind of sneaks up and then kind of goes away. And then it sneaks up and we get quite a bit of it at the end. So here's a little bit. So bar later, right? So a little bit of imitation. He's kind of making this push. So I have sort of, in my view of the work, taken it apart to think of it in 3 large sections. Variations 1 through 10, you'll hear why. Then variations 11 through 20, you'll hear kind of a good division point. And then 21 to the end is sort of a big push. Other scholars look at it differently. But as we make this push then towards variation 10, variation 5 kind of picks up the pace a little bit. So obviously the repeated note is something interesting, the pickup is something that he's latching onto, but in no way is that opening, just to kind of keep your minds where I'm at underlying all of this. No way is this anywhere near the expressive world of variation 4. Right? So there's my whole, I guess what I would say is what used to be disruption idea, and I'm now replacing that with this kind of champion of diversity idea. Variation 6 really overdoes the trill and uses a lot of imitation. It's not hard to hear. One of the interesting things that we always find in Beethoven's music is this sense of space. He used the entire piano, and this is obviously clear here, where we're spanning about 4 or 5 octaves between the two hands in a relatively quick amount of time. So again, he's making a push. If you had to imagine variation 5 and this, they're very different, but yet they're accumulating intensity, okay? That continues in variation 7. And again, the idea of space. So 1, 2, 3, 4 octaves in the first beat. The first beat. That's incredible. This concept of space and time within this work, I mean, I could go on and on and on. Don't worry, I won't, I promise. But the concept of space and how it evolves and how you have these ebbs and flows of big space, little space, is a very critical part of the energy of this work. The idea of time and how Beethoven kind of makes a push and then pulls back. It all goes along with this sense of struggle and the attempt to achieve, kind of a musical immortality. The other running underlying narrative of this work that I haven't talked about is that Hans von Bülow, who was an amazing pianist, Liszt's son-in-law for a time, he talked about this piece as being a compendium of musical history. Now, ironically, my friend Maynard Solomon says he doesn't read this piece that way, but I very much do. Beethoven was dealing with the end of his life works. He was, by 1823, 1824, the last string quartets, the final, the last symphony. These are big deals, the final piano sonata. And he is absolutely referencing other generic sources throughout this piece. I've already talked about Bach. He will absolutely reference Bach, but he's also going to become very forward-looking in what he does in these variations. And that all goes along with this crucial core concept that I have about how every variation is pulling something from that theme. It is constantly there. But it is so different with every variation. It is so absolutely markedly different from one to the next that suddenly you see this infinite space of creative possibilities. And it's so exciting for me to see that, to think about it, etc. So speaking of generic references, we've just had variation 7. He sped up the rhythms, we have triplets, all of these things. And what does he do next? He pulls back, because we have a long way to go in this process. Now, he didn't write this piece in order, by the way, but this is how he ended it up. And so that's what I'm dealing with. But he pulls back in his kind of inertia towards variation 10. That's very singing. He's changed the fourth to a third. He's gotten soft, he's gotten legato. He's got this very interesting half step in the accompaniment. There's also a half step in the grace note idea and the turn figure. This also really sounds like Brahms, but Brahms wasn't born until 1833. If Beethoven was still alive today, I would totally estimate that something that you hear on Wednesday night might have come from him. He very much knew what could happen in the future, and he pushed those boundaries. He opens 111 Sonata with a diminished seventh leap. You know, that was provocatory in 1824. So we've pulled back in Variation 8. Variation 9 is marked Allegro pesante e risoluto. If this were more lighthearted, it might be funny, but it's very, very almost mundane in its process. And so while it might have a sarcastic hint to it, it's very serious. It's in minor. It's the first one he writes in minor, by the way. To counterbalance that, here's Variation 10. And it ends, I'll try to pick up here. It's pretty big, pretty virtuosic. There's why I'm labeling this the end of the first section, expressively. It's a big ending. He's transfigured to virtuosity. If you think of variations as a rhythmic diminution process, what's the fastest thing I can do at the piano? Play a trill. This is full of trills. You can't go faster, really, on a piano. So what does he do then? You know, I have these kind of accumulating processes at work. And so for Variation 11, Variation 10, super virtuosic. Variation 11, he's going to put the brakes on again, because we've got to keep climbing our mountain, so to speak. So here's Variation 11. Completely different than what I played you at the end of 10. And yet, both of them are bringing us the theme in this new unified way. But they're so diverse. Okay, Variation 12 kind of picks up where 11 left off. Some of these variations kind of do work together and form pairs. So Variation 12 kind of is an elaboration. Very, very smooth, very lyrical, a little bit imitative. Then we get 13. That's pretty drastic. There are more rests in the first 4 bars than there are notes. And silence is very profound. Maynard Solomon calls this kind of an homage to a Freemason's knock of entry. And that probably makes a lot of sense. I could go more into it, but I think what you have here is this embodiment of the repeated gesture, this incredibly Don Giovanni-esque dotted figure. It's in A minor, so we finally left home for a brief minute, tonic-wise. We're not in C major or minor. But again, a completely drastic change from Variation 12. My imagination doesn't go here. I do at a steakhouse, but I don't compositionally. So what happens in 14, you would imagine there's no way he could get more different after that. And yet this is Variation 14. complete moment of repose, high registers. He's still got the dotted rhythms. He's got this massive space between my voices. I mean, there's all sorts of metaphors happening in this texture, but it is a complete disruption of 14. So 13 disrupted 12, 14 disrupts 13. Then we have 15. You think it can't possibly become any more different, right? Okay, that's pretty different. So he's obviously, we're in kind of a virtuosic ebb right now with the texture, and that continues in 16 and 17, which are paired together. That's pretty different. And then 17 is like the textural reverse of 16. The fast notes are in my right hand. So this is where he's increasing momentum. He's writing kind of like an etude for both hands. It also happens to be smack dab in the middle of the work. Beethoven was very aware of symmetry. He's very aware of proportions, and this is no exception. So what do you do after you write those? You pull back for variation 18. So on and so forth. Completely different kind of spiritual world. We're in a higher register. The rhythms have slowed down. Variation 19 resumes kind of this thrust of energy. So the first section kind of pulls down from a high register. The second section pulls up from the lower register. So again, we have this upwards thrust that's going on. I need to play you the end of 19 going into 20. Just a little bit. That's very effective. The kinds of note values that he uses in the score is very much a callback to kind of Palestrinian era contrapuntal writing. It's dotted half notes. Your fastest note values are quarter notes. There's imitation, there's counterpoint happening. And of course, it's in this very different expressive space than what was previous. And so I just want to call back what I played at the opening of 111, because this reminds me a little bit. They're in different registers, but in some ways, the culmination of energy at this point is similar. And this is variation 20, which is where I mark the end of the second section, because it's so deeply calm. 21, so we've ended in this ethereal sort of state of the sublime, and here's 21. Now, 21 is fascinating because variation 21 to me is like Schumann. But Schumann is only about 13 years old when this was written. If you understand Schumann's work, he turns on a dime. He'll be in one phase, and then suddenly we hear another expressive side of his personality very quickly if you know some of the pieces in Carnival. Here we start out with the raucous, and then he interrupts that with meno allegro tempo marking. Completely different world inside of its own variation. So that's very much forward-looking to what Schumann's process is. And Schumann, to me, always sounds like a very individualized composer in his style for the keyboard, and yet we're hearing it in Beethoven, so he literally disrupts himself inside of one of the variations. What happens next is maybe one of the best places in the whole piece. So the 21 ends with this, and here's 22. So I have to take a second, I'm sorry, I promise you I'll try to finish. This is a quote from Leporello's aria from Don Giovanni. Now this is important because I said he references other generic sources, and Beethoven, we know, played viola in an orchestra in Bonn when Don Giovanni was premiered, so he knew the work. He also, of course, the reason Beethoven went to Vienna was to study with Mozart in 1791, and then Mozart passed away, so he went to Haydn. And most importantly, though, Leporello's aria, if you know Don Giovanni, comes right after a rape and a murder. And the next scene is Leporello complaining about all he does is work all day. So it just so happens that Leporello is singing that descending fourth. So Beethoven's pulling in this operatic reference that is so absolutely full of potential meaning because of what happens in the opera. And it's comic, but Beethoven, of course, kind of foreshortens the motive, and it's comic, but it's also agitated in its expressive idea. So he really turns this around into kind of accessing that tragic part of the opera as well. The next variation well, this is about the time that keyboard virtuosity was almost at its beginning of its zenith. This is a direct parody emulation of a composer named Kramer who wrote a lot of keyboard etudes. I don't know which one came first, most likely the Kramer, but this is very much a virtuosic work. And it's written so that the pianist has to work very hard to play all the notes. So again, there's that generic reference idea that's going on. The next piece is, or the next variation, 24, is labeled a fuguetta. So this is obviously a contrapuntal piece. It's obviously more serious in its emotional state. But it is not a full-fledged fugue, and all it does is really tell us that we've pulled back in momentum, and we have a long journey still left. Variation 25. So to me, I hear this as kind of a peasant lawnmower. So it's this more earthy version of the waltz. And again, what Maynard Solomon talked about, these two arcs that happens in Beethoven's late style. The one arc is from the kind of low style to the high, and the other arc is from the opposite tendency, which is the high style to the low, and how those two worlds intersect. And he's alluding back to another dance, and that's really, I think, the important part of why this was placed here, because the waltz is a dance, and he's reminding us of that psychologically at this juncture. What happens in 26 and 27, this is kind of a paired unit. Again, a massive registral space. I mean, you actually see me moving across those 4 octaves. 27 is more exuberant. Okay, so he's accumulating energy because we're making another climb, right? It's kind of like the airplane. Maybe there's some turbulence, so we're going to climb a little higher. Variation 28 sounds like this. So this is choral music. This is absolutely choral music, but I learned that from my former teacher at Indiana, Edmund Battersby, who has since passed away. But it is him that I am indebted, because he put me on this path, because he asked me to write the liner notes for his 2-CD recording of the Diabelli variations. And had I not done that, I would not have written my dissertation. I would never have learned Diabelli. But he always said to me when I would interview him about the work, when I was working on the liner notes, he said, this is choral. And it is choral. It's kind of a 4 or 5 part texture, unison, and it's meaningful because what is Beethoven doing at the end of his life? He's writing the first choral symphony, and that's never really been done. In all of humanity, that had never been done, and that symbolic gesture of combining voices, bringing together, is so remarkable. And I think it was on his mind here. So again, this concept of generic references, thinking about musical history, thinking about his place in the world, thinking about beyond his place in the world, I think comes through there. Variation 29 is a Baroque recitative. It's somber. You have a single voice singing. So we've gone from choral to recitative, which is interesting, maybe not surprising, but we've also gone from the world of C major to C minor. And then variation 30. Is actually in the key of E flat. So for the first time, we've had a little bit of A minor, we've had some C minor, but we've got a little bit of E flat, which will wind back to C minor for the next variation. Maynard Solomon calls this a pilgrim's walk. And if you're thinking in terms of a spiritual narrative, that makes a great deal of sense at this point. We have a solitary pilgrim, and then it becomes imitative. And this is setting up for the final 3 variations. And if you wanted to think about the final 3 variations as being their own section, many people have done that because the last 3 are kind of the Mount Everest of the work. So variation 31 is a direct allusion to Bach's Goldberg variations, which in the monumental world of keyboard literature, the Goldberg variations are the greatest example of keyboard variations, I would say, prior to this. And in Bach's 25th variation, he writes something quite similar to what Beethoven writes here. I haven't said too much about it. There's your grace note. There's your turn figure, but very elaborated. Repeated notes. It's all there, but how different is that place from this? And yet, everything is still there. Every aspect is still an underpinning in this music. So what comes next is one of the greatest, probably, keyboard fugues written. It's in E flat major. It is what we call a triple fugue, fortunately for me with 10 fingers. So you have 3 subjects, and they're all presented one at a time and developed. And then he puts them, of course, all together at the end to make it just super fun. And this is, I would argue, I've talked about Bach, but this is a Handelian fugue. The kind of counterpoint that's needed for these thick textures really has to come from a hallelujah chorus kind of fugue, one that almost breaks down because of its involvement. Bach's counterpoint didn't break down. Handel's did, because it was more vocally conceived. And the texture becomes so saturated that I think you'll hear what I mean by this. But the opening of the fugue absolutely pulls in every possible motivic idea. There's our 4th. There's our repeated notes. We have a sequence. We have the turn figure. Okay, so everything's there right from the beginning. So here's a little bit of the opening. Okay, it seems innocent enough. About 3 pages later, Beethoven lands on a big diminished 7th chord. So clearly we're not done. You don't end on that. And then here he goes. Then we get a triple fugue later on. Pretty intense, very thick, right? So the counterpoint begins to break down, because this fugue cannot be the final statement of this piece. You can't break down your genre and call that the end, right? And so what we get is, I still would argue, the greatest musical transition ever written, bar none. So he ends on a diminished 7th. At this point, yes, I'm going to talk and play. He rewrites an E flat as a D sharp. Same note. It allows him to resolve there. And then we get a minuet. That's a pretty amazing measure. It's a measure. To go from where I was, this deeply fire and brimstone diminished seventh chord, up and down the piano. He rewrites one note, and now I'm back in this C major for a minuet. The minuet is crucial in all of this because, of course, it's a dance. It's in the style of Mozart. It's very delicate when it starts. It's also calling upon Beethoven's last sonata. And we know what Beethoven thought about Mozart, so it's absolutely makes sense that he would write it in this way. After the minuet presents itself, there's kind of another little series of variations or a coda, however you want to think about it. But this is the world that he kind of ends up in. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. After he presents that really fast rhythmic diminution texture, which ends a little bit. He slows down the rhythms. Faster rhythms. Faster rhythms. That's the end of the piece. So what he does in those final bars is he finally, after 50 minutes, gives us the rhythmic diminutions that he was supposed to start off with. But to return to this kind of spiritual idea, this is the end of Opus 111, or close to it. It's very, very similar, so those two works are informing each other critically at a bunch of different places. I was kind of hurrying, but this final utterance of the Diabelli, pianissimo, right here, you have this. Is that a comic stroke? Is it a tragic disruption? What is that? Well, structurally, if you're a geeky theory person, the waltz moves from E down to C melodically. And so his final chord recaptures that E as kind of the last statement. And some people could say, well, he disrupted the spiritual transcendentalism of the work. But in actuality, I think he absolutely stays with that premise because his whole life, his whole narrative, this whole piece is about struggle and achievement. And as I have mapped or troped on top of this idea of that critical space between championing difference and holding on to similarity at the same time. So when you have those two elements collapsing really in the same measure, I think he just proved my point, metaphorically. And it's, I will actually quote myself, which I never do. I reread my dissertation yesterday. I actually liked it, surprisingly. But here's what I wrote in 2006. Beethoven finds God in this work, not through an exalted beginning, but in a presentation of the literal birth and rites of passage of a spiritual journey. At times the spirit struggles, at times it mourns, and at times it holds the fire and strength of a divine being. All of this, each memory, each phenomenon, contributes to the spiritual development of Diabelli's simple and humble waltz. And I still agree with that. You know, like I said, I've had this very powerful amount of time to go back and reflect on this piece. And many of you have been such great friends and have been in the audience with me when I've given partial lecture recitals about this music. And I've never had a chance to kind of get up and really say what this piece deserves to have said, because there's a lot there. And so I've had the value of time and reflection, and as you'll see tomorrow and Wednesday, the distinction of adding to this incredible piece. And as I've thought about this in the context of the other things, it's only kind of illuminated to me the power that one person, the power of creativity and the mind and the imagination, and what one life can give to the world. Tomorrow, we're going to see what many lives can give to the world, unified by one idea. Sorry to be emotional, but I really feel blessed to talk about this. I feel hopefully blessed to play it tonight, and I'm so grateful that my friends are here. So thank you.